Hello Gwinnett, this is Moss, and today we're going to be learning how to make pizza dough.
That's very good.
This is part of a larger series called Bread Basics, so follow along and be watching out for new videos to crop up because we're going to go through a whole series of different breads that you can make at home very easily. Let's get started. All we need to make this recipe is flour, yeast, salt, honey, olive oil, and water. Oh. In front of me, I have 2 flours, and you've definitely heard of all-purpose flour, but you may not be as familiar with bread flour. What is the difference between these two? They look exactly the same, they feel the same, they taste the same.
No!
Your entire life, you've grown up. You've been told you can't eat raw cookie dough. You can't eat raw cookie dough. And you thought to yourself, I know why that is. It's because it contains raw eggs, and raw eggs have salmonella, and I don't want to eat salmonella. Did you know that you can actually get poisoned by the flour in cookie dough? Yes, exactly. Flour can be contaminated with E. coli. Is that the thing that gets my lettuce recalled every other week? Yes, yes it is. It can give you nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramps. Do you want any of those things? No. So don't try your dough. So we're not going to be trying the dough today, but we are going to be making 2 different doughs and compare the difference. I don't know about you all, but anytime a recipe calls for something that I don't already have in my pantry, I always ask myself, can I substitute this? Not to spoil the rest of this video, but yes, you can always substitute all-purpose flour for bread flour, and you're going to end up with a dough that is delicious and wonderful, and you're gonna eat it as soon as it comes out of the oven. But there are some key differences. So let's get started.
To start, we need 1.5 cups of warm water. Now, I'm using the thermometer mostly for show. In all honesty, I mostly just use my finger to see whether or not it feels warm, but not quite hot. If it's too hot, it'll kill the yeast, but if it's too cold, the yeast aren't gonna wake up. Now that our water is heated up and all our ingredients are assembled, let's get to making some dough. So first we're going to pour in 1.5 cups of our warm water, and then we're going to add our yeast. If this were live, I would be asking somebody in the audience right now to read for me what this lid says. It says, refrigerate after opening. Most recipes will call for a packet of yeast, and if you have a packet, great, add that. If you have the can, like I do, that means 2¼ teaspoons of yeast. But I kind of treat yeast like I treat garlic, wherein if it says 1 clove, I might be adding 3 or 4. And then we add in the rest of our quote-unquote wet ingredients. I count any wet ingredient as anything that's going to dissolve. So we're going to add 3 tablespoons of honey. I never really measure, I just give it a good circle around the bowl. About 2 teaspoons of salt, add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. We're gonna give everything a good mix to get all of our ingredients nice and incorporated before we add 3.5 cups of our flour. In this batch, we have the bread flour. I'm going to be making a second batch with just the all-purpose flour. I wanted to show you the bread flour because this flour is actually higher in gluten than all-purpose flour. And you'll begin to see that at work once we start mixing this dough. After cup 1, we kind of just have bread soup. After cup 2, it's starting to get a little thicker, but it's not until cup 3 that we really start to see the dough form, and here you can see it stretching. It doesn't just want to act like a cookie dough or a cake batter would. It really has this pull to it. I'm going to add in the last ½ cup. If this were a whole integer of cups, I would add in that last cup of flour as 2 ½ cups. It allows you to better incorporate it. And after I give it a good mix, I turn it out onto my table, and now I'm going to start the kneading process. And here I am just pushing it with my hands and then pulling it back. As you can see, immediately it starts making a huge mess. That is to be expected with this dough. It is going to be incredibly sticky from start to finish. If you don't want to make a mess everywhere, you can do this in a mixer using the dough hook and just beat it in an electric mixer for about 10 minutes is what I would suggest on a medium to low speed. I have this bread scraper next to me with the red handle, and that allows me to scrape up some of the dough so that I can recombine it into more of a ball as we continue through. How do we know when our dough is done? For most doughs, it's when it stops being sticky and starts being elastic and has a lot of spring back when you handle it. But this is never going to stop being sticky. So instead, we are going to use the window pane test, where we stretch out a small piece of dough as thin as we can until we can see light shine through it. And if we can see light shine through our dough, that means that it's stretchy enough that it's ready to start rising.
Okay, so now that our dough passes the window pane test, we are going to put it into the bowl to rise. I'm gonna oil it pretty generously. Make sure that I get all of the sides. Wherever the dough is gonna touch, you want it to be oiled. And then I'm gonna take my bread scraper. You can use your hands if you don't have one of these. And I'm gonna kind of gather up the sides till I can get a bowl. Woo. There we go. Okay, she's in. And then we're gonna do a little bit more olive oil on top. Rub that around. And that is partially because olive oil is delicious, but it's also to cover the dough and make sure that it's not gonna dehydrate. See you in an hour. All right, it has been an hour. The dough that we were working on together has almost doubled in size, but we're gonna give it a little more time. This is our bread flour, and this is our all-purpose flour. And you always wanna make sure that you cover your dough in plastic wrap. It missed. Now I'm gonna show you how to shape pizza dough. Even though you may have been tempted to flour previously when it was really sticky, and we did not, now we're gonna flour very generously. So here we are, we have a generously floured surface. So this is gonna deflate a little bit, but I'm actually gonna reserve part of it. I'm gonna cut off about a third of it for breadsticks later on. This is our beautiful pizza dough. We're gonna sprinkle the top with a little flour. And this flour is just all-purpose flour. I have my top well floured, and what we're gonna do is we're essentially gonna push and fan. Push. The oven is preheated to 450 degrees. And I'm gonna go closer to the edge than you think you wanna go, but then we're gonna fan it out. And I think this is not floured enough. So I have this sheet. If you are super fancy and have a pizza stone, you could whip that out about now. So I have some semolina flour. I would also recommend using like a coarse-grained corn flour, but basically we're just gonna give the bottom of this a little bit of a crispiness. So I'm just gonna sprinkle it and then kind of move it around. So now we're going to begin the process of transferring. This is likely gonna get really big, but I like crust, so I'm not too worried about it. This is the fun part. Topping time! So we are all set. This is ready to go in. Pizza! If we listen real close, there we go. Sounds kind of hollow. So now we're doing the next pizza. We're gonna learn from the mistakes of last time. This is bread flour. I think mistake number one, not enough flour. Gonna extra flour the top, and then I think I'm gonna do a full half of this out for breadsticks. We're gonna go and fan, and fan. And here, you can see that there's all of these little bubbles where the gluten has managed to be super stretchy, and so you have all of these gorgeous air pockets. So I'm just gonna focus on the edges. Our beautiful glutinous second pizza dough is now ready to transfer. This is, there they are. So this is super duper thin, so we're gonna try not to tear it as we transfer it. I highly recommend that you make sure that whatever you're gonna bake on is what you have the pizza actually on before you start adding the toppings. Because I added all the toppings once and then tried to transfer it over, and if you see how floppy it's behaving right now, you can imagine how that worked out for me. We have toppings now. Oh, wow. It's still boiling, but this, that sounds great. I always recommend letting any pizza rest for about 10 minutes before you start cutting into it. So if you notice, as our all-purpose flour one, we didn't really hear that much of a crunch when we cut into it. And as I suspected, the crust is huge. Yum. There you are. Oh god. That's very good. This is the test of a good bread, is when you go squish and it goes right back out. That is structure. Now how many pizzas do you give this? Val says they give it 8 out of 10 pizzas. Our second pizza has cooled. Okay, so on this one, I think you can already see the difference. The crumb here is much wider. So here we have a lot more variation in the size, and the holes are a lot bigger. It still has the same spring back that the other one does. They both have the spring back, but this just has more aeration in it as compared to the all-purpose flour. As I said, both quite tasty.